Hey everyone, welcome back to the Wisdom Tradition podcast. My name's Alex, and today I'll be presenting part three of a four-part series on Pythagoras and Pythagorean philosophy. So, this one is going to be picking up where part two left off. And if you'll remember, part two, which was overall titled From Unity to Diversity, looked at the fundamental numerical principles of the Pythagorean system. So 0, 1, 2, and 3. At the very end of that article, that previous section, part two, at the very end of it, we discussed Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva, the Hindu trinity, as a sort of case study as part of our investigation of the Triad, the Pythagorean principle of three. And in this article, now in part four, we're going to be picking up where that case study left off, and in so doing, we're going to be introducing the number four, or what the Pythagoreans called the Tetrad. So we're going to be analyzing the Tetrad and the esoteric meaning of the number four. And I'm going to start off by introducing this topic through the lens of Mahamaya. If you'll remember, for those who've been following the channel, I did an episode relatively recently on a lecture of Manly Hall's titled Mahamaya, Mother of the Buddha. And that was actually done as part of our previous series on Mahayana Buddhism. And so this is sort of playing off of some of the themes that we discussed in that video. But overall, this section, part three of this four-part series on Pythagoras, it's called For the Number of Creation. And so section one of this part three is called Mahamaya, Mother of the Buddha, and so I'm going to pick up there. And by the way, I just want to mention that in the article version of this, if you go check out my Substack, there's lots of visuals. Like each subsection, I try to have a new and appropriate visual for that section. So I have a visual here of rather than of Mahamaya from the Buddhist tradition, which I'm referencing in the title, I have the sort of equivalent concept being referenced in the ancient Egyptian religious mythology with their goddess Nut, or spelled N-U-T, Nut. I'm not sure. I'm pretty sure it's not pronounced Nut. It's probably Nut. But yeah, so that's my sort of analogous to the Mahamaya concept that I'm going to be breaking down here. So, and again, if you want to go more into this, I have that previous lecture on Manly Hall's discussion of this Mahamaya principle. But let me pick up now. So this is overall number J, or part J in our overall Pythagoras series, because this is essentially intended to be one long chapter. But I've broken it up. So anyway, this is part J of this section of this chapter, and yeah, it's called Mahamaya, Mother of the Buddha. In our previous article on Pythagorean philosophy, which was part two of this series, we concluded with a discussion of the Hindu Trimurti, which is the three-faced godhead that exists at the foundation of India's ancient Brahmanic wisdom teachings. Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva personify the creative triad of Hindu religious philosophy. They describe God's three active creative powers, with Brahma personifying the manifest spirit of creation. So Brahma is spirit, Vishnu is its soul, or Brahma's soul, and then Shiva is the form generating power. It's an aspect of Brahma, but it's expressed through Vishnu. So it's like a power reflex of Vishnu. And so Shiva is a form generating power. In Sanskrit, it's termed manas, M-A-N-A-S. And in other traditions, it has different names. The Greeks turned it the demiurgus. But it's a form generating power, and it governs the building, preservation, and destruction of bodily forms. That's the dynamic that the triad of Brahma, Vishnu, Shiva is dealing with here. So we have spirit, soul, body, essentially. But body in the sense of the body sort of vivifying, body forming, body building power of the soul. So the soul interfaces with body through the Shiva principle. While the triune godhead of Brahma, Vishnu, Shiva is widely recognized as the foundation of ancient Hindu religious thinking, it is not actually the primary trinity of their creation myth. Rather, The Trimurti is considered a secondary aspect of deity, one that emerges only after the initial emergence of a more primordial trinity, one that involves the initial emergence of Brahma out of Brahman. So Brahma, Vishnu, Shiva is a trinity, but there's another trinity that's more fundamental that has to do with the emergence of Brahma from Brahman. And again, there's different specific terms that different traditions have used for these two principles. But essentially, we're talking about in our previous video, we talked about the difference between unity and oneness. That oneness was like the outer face of unity. And so that's the type of relationship that we're seeing here between Brahman and Brahma. So Brahman is this absolute unmanifest state, like the Tao. And then Brahma is the emergence of a bound state within the context of the eternal undefined state. So the emergence of a defined state is the emergence of Brahma. This is the emergence of a being in relation to this abstract principle of infinite being. So that's just kind of a recap of things we were talking about before. Again, moving towards our new concept that we'll be introducing, which I'm going to be talking about here. So what is left out of the creative triad of Brahma, Vishnu, Shiva is reference to creation's feminine receptive principle. In Hindu terminology, this feminine principle, which is like yin to the Trimurti's yang, meaning if we bundle that whole Brahma, Vishnu, Shiva set, that those three principles into one category, that category is the yang, is describing the yang activity of deity. But there's also a yin aspect that's not incorporated in this trinity. And this yin aspect involves the mystery of Mahamaya, the mother goddess. And again, different traditions have different names for this. But here I'm referencing it, at least initially, as Mahamaya. But specifically, I'm referencing a yin counterpart to Brahma, essentially. Mahamaya is often referenced simply as Maya, though differences may be discerned between the two. Mahamaya being the higher octave or higher spiritual principle of Maya, which is often connotated with matter, material existence, and illusion, or the falling into illusion. So we have Mahamaya and Maya, and actually the relationship here is similar to that between Brahman and Brahma, or between, in Theosophy you see Parabrahm. So you have Brahma and Parabrahm. So para is that prefix means beyond, and essentially that's what Maha means. The prefix Maha in front of Maya means above or beyond, or greater than. So we're talking about something that exists in relation to Maya as its superior spiritual principle. So the higher octave of Maya being something that we often see referenced in terms of matter and illusion as like a negative connotation. But Mahamaya, the higher spiritual octave of this, has to do with this mysterious capacity of mind. Something that we discussed also in relation to this principle of Vajradhara, of like the universal mind that emerges out of the Adi Buddha, the all-encompassing oneness. So in a way, these things, Mahamaya and Vajradhara, are we're engaging with different traditions, sort of interfacing with the same principle. But in this case, we're explicitly referencing the idea of a feminine emphasis to this ultimate mind principle. So Mahamaya is the goddess, the mother, the cosmic mother. So matter and illusion, which are normally kind of associated with the principle of Maya, matter and illusion, they're byproducts. They don't describe the principle itself, but they describe a byproduct of this Maya principle. And this Maya principle is really, we're referring to mind. So there's mind, and then there's the higher spiritual principle that is sort of the foundation of mind. So there's matter and illusion are byproducts of mind, but they don't alone encompass mind in all its various aspects. In its highest state, mind is comprised of an extremely subtle quality of matter, one that interfaces closest with the domain of pure spirit or Brahman. So Brahma interfaces or exists in a plane or in a state of matter that is not in matter, but is sort of a sort of the higher mental foundation of matter, which is a principle of or a state of mind that is it's immaterial and it's a pure intellect. So there's this. Remember in the previous episode we talked about the difference between intellectual numbers and sciential numbers. So here we're talking about intellectual numbers. There's this idea in between unity and the number one is this realm of intellectual number, which interfaces with the soul and the mind, and it has to do with the archetype. And we talked about this idea of the monad and the duad and the triad and the tetrad, and these are all intellectual numbers, meaning they're spiritual principles that exist sort of at the cusp of matter, but they become the archetype and they shape how everything that manifests actually within matter, within that dense foundation of matter, that not self. It's sort of at the cusp of the self, where the self meets the not self. We have this mind, and this mind, initially in its highest spiritual state, fashions the plan of creation as a mathematical archetype, as a pure number, and then that number becomes objectified, I guess you could say, or becomes impressed and takes a sort of clothing as it gets impressed upon matter, and that clothing is in the form of sciential number and of the mathematics and geometry and various other derivative aspects of sort of the numerical sciences as the Pythagoreans would approach them. But geometry and the various harmony, music, things like that, architecture, these things all interface with this idea of number and the emergence of number out of mind. So that's kind of why, just to emphasize this idea of mind and the importance in the role that the mind plays in the Pythagorean doctrine, that's really what I'm developing here. And you'll notice I talked about mind, but in a genderless way in our previous discussion on the number 2. And there was also sort of a genderless discussion of mind that we did in our previous series on Mahayana Buddhism with the discussion of that principle of Vajradhara. But now with the Tetrad, we're approaching a sort of gendered concept of mind. A type of there's a need to differentiate it from a yang aspect. So there's a yin counterpart now emerging, and this is a form that mind takes. And so these are the foundational ideas behind the Tetrad and the duad, but how the Tetrad is born as this principle of creation, but there's a masculine and feminine, there's a yin and yang aspect to it, but there's a distinct sort of yin quality, a receptiveness to it, and a guiding intellectual nature to this principle. So that's what we're going into more. And just to finish off the last paragraph here of this initial section, Mahamaya personifies mind or soul as it exists and operates on the most subtle and spiritual plane of matter. So it's Mahamaya. It's actually considered above matter, but since it's a spiritual principle, since it has a yin aspect to it, and matter is sort of a yin aspect as well, then we're talking about it as something that's beyond matter, but of the same category. As a feminine principle of creation, both Mahamaya and Maya imply yin quality, a yin quality, meaning they are passive or receptive in nature. By contrast, the father and child principles associated with deity, so God the Father and God the Son, you could say, they're yang in that they are actively manifesting their consciousness and experiencing creation. So yang is actively experiencing, and then the yin, in the form of Mahamaya or Maya, is receiving that conscious energy and sort of directing it into the creation of a form. And the form becomes, as we will see, the child of these two. So we have the yang becomes the father and the yin becomes the mother. And then from the mingling of yin and yang is generated the form of creation. The universe as a a host of a diverse field of differentiated forms. This whole scenario, this whole universe only emerges in context to this interaction of these primordial father and mother principles. And as we'll see, this principle of three becomes the father of creation, and the principle of four becomes its mother, and then the form itself becomes the child, and this child is associated with the number five, which is also associated with humanity or mankind, the archetype of humanity. So we'll be going into that as we proceed. Mind plays host to creation. It receives the impetus from the father. The conscious impetus for creation is received by the mind or the mother and converted into a plan or an archetype, which becomes the foundation of the material creation. So mind plays host to creation, receiving the active creative motion of universal consciousness and also of the self. So the two levels, Mahamaya and Maya, kind of have to do with consciousness and self. It's those two levels of consciousness being this absolute, and then self being a more defined state version of it, a defined state of this absolute principle of consciousness. In the same way, Mahamaya and Maya have a similar relationship. So consciousness is the greater and self is the lesser, and that's the same dynamic with Mahamaya and Maya. In Hindu mythology, Mahamaya is considered a Shakti or female consort of Brahma, while Maya is considered the same for, you might say, Vishnu. So it's the polarity of the soul, whereas Mahamaya is the polarity of the spirit. But by spirit, we're not talking about unity, we're talking about the number three, because unity is beyond, it's not considered part of creation. It's the fundamental context within which creation emerges. So, in Pythagorean philosophy, they say that number really emerges, or the analysis of number begins with three. And two and one and zero are actually principles, abstract principles. So the previous article that we did, part 2, was to talk really about these principles. And in this section, we're talking about how these principles become actualized into the universe, to becoming the universe as a form. And this happens through the relationship between 3, 4, and 5, or the Triad, the Tetrad, and the Pentad. So this idea of a Shakti or consort of the divine Trinity, we're talking about something that is a necessary counterpart to the Yang. So if Brahma, Vishnu, Shiva is Yang in nature, then we need a counterpart to that, and that's where we start to engage with these ideas of the divine feminine and the mother goddess and such. But the sexualization or the gendering of principles references the idea that a dynamic relationship takes place, a dynamic creative relationship takes place between creation's yin and yang, or feminine and masculine principles. This polarity is part of the fundamental generation process. So the yang principle sounds out the word of creation. The yin principle receives that word and then converts it into a living universe of evolving life forms. And that living universe, as we'll see, takes on the qualities of both its parents. So it adopts a yang aspect and a yin aspect. And this child principle becomes the means through which the yang and yin principles can interact and become synthesized with each other. So abstractly, they exist beyond the sort of form of the universe and play host to it, this polarity, this father-mother. But then this polarity is synthesized. It's synthesized within the self as the self grows and evolves. And the self comes to completion by perfecting the equilibrium of these two principles, the solar and lunar principles. So that's the conclusion of part J, and now we're going to go into part K. Law, mother of the self. So our previous section was called Mahamaya, mother of the Buddha, and now this section is really a translation of that. Like, what does that mean? It means law, mother of the self. So we're associating now this principle of mind, this spiritual principle, Mahamaya or Vajradhara, that this becomes the basis of law. So mind in its feminine aspect becomes law, and then in its yang aspect it becomes self. So that's kind of what we're dealing with here. Before creation takes place, when God resides solely in the condition of unity, yang and yin are not differentiated, there is only oneness. For creation to take place, consciousness must step itself down from at one-ment with law. In other words, yang and yin must separate. Self, or yang, must leave home, quote unquote, and remove itself from complete identification with law, which is yin in this case. So yang and yin, heaven and earth, separate. In this way, the first step of creation takes place when the differentiation of yang from yin occurs. Here, mind emerges out of unified consciousness in order to partition self from not self. This partitioning signals the self's falling into a relative degree of ignorance pertaining to its full knowledge of and identification with the law. The higher aspects of the law that self forgets become hidden within the mystery of the not self. You see? Self and not self. So what not self is a matter of perception. So the self perceives the not self. And this is a manifestation, this perception is a manifestation of the law becoming sort of separated from. So the self has to remove itself from complete identification with the law, because when it's completely identified with the law, there's only unity. So when self emerges out of unity, it does so by differentiating a context of not self. And what that not self really represents is the law. So within what we call matter, which is the not self, is law. And this law is a directing agent. It's the administrating power within creation. And the self becomes creation. So the self can only become creation by following this law. So that's the idea here. So the first step of creation takes place when the differentiation of yang and yin occurs. And this is equivalent to mind emerging out of unified consciousness in order to partition a self from not self. This partitioning, this act of partitioning consciousness, signals the self falling into a relative degree of ignorance pertaining to its full knowledge of and identification with the law. The higher aspect of law that self forgets becomes hidden within the mystery of the not self. Again, I said this before. Only by differentiating itself from its opposite, the not self or matter, does the self regain the context necessary for self-experience. So not self is necessary for the self to define its own being. But the cost that the self pays for making this differentiation of itself from the not self, the cost it pays is that at least a portion of the law's full extent and workings become hidden from the self, or from the self's awareness. It doesn't identify with them. It has not accepted them as a fact of consciousness, so they remain not part of the not self. As a price it pays for its own self-existence, the self must fall into a relative state of ignorance concerning the highest wisdom of the law. Consequently, the self becomes enmeshed within the matrix of matter, meaning it has accepted the false belief in the not self, and as a consequence has become trapped in this self-made illusion. Maya's traditional association with the self's fall into illusion is based on the idea that matter or Maya is a downward reflection or a secondary consequence of the self's perception of the not self. So the self is the perception of matter is actually the perception of not self. So what we're calling Maya is the sort of ancient Hindu term for this idea of matter in terms of its mythological concept, and it has a feminine aspect. And so this principle of matter is actually a creation of the self, of the self's perception. The idea being that in truth, spirit and matter are not actually differentiated, that this differentiation is a perception that takes place within the self. As long as the self holds firm in its belief in the reality of the not self, it will remain attached to at least some aspect of matter, or Maya, and therefore the fullness of Mahamaya, or universal intelligence, or the law, must remain concealed to it. The acceptance of illusion, or Maya, is a necessary aspect of self-existence. Without it, consciousness could never be able to become individualized into the formation of self-consciousness. The law's higher transcendent aspects, the ones hidden from the knowledge of self, remember they're concealed within the not-self. So they're hidden from self. These higher aspects of the law are concealed behind, quote, the veil of Maya, which is the veil of the self's acceptance of not-self. Only by transcending the not-self, the perception of not-self, thereby penetrating the boundaries of self-existence, is consciousness able to regain full identity with the law and lift Isis's veil, so to speak. So Isis's veil is this veil of the not-self. The Tetrad, the next section here. And this is part 4, or number 4 here. So the Tetrad is the spiritual principle of 4. The self is inherently a threefold being, as we've discussed. Intellect, which is a aspect of mind that the self intimately engages with. So there's this aspect of self that is born from this higher abstract concept of mind, which we talked about, Vajradhara. And then here we have another aspect of mind existing in relation to the self. And the self's, its move to create. So intellect is involved with this aspect. So the self is inherently a threefold being, and then the intellect exists as a fourth state or condition that emerges alongside the threefold self. This fourth condition was called by the Pythagoreans the Tetrad, which symbolized to them law's rulership over material creation. So the self becomes objectified as material creation. It objectifies its own being as spirit, soul, body. Those are the three realms, and matter is that highest realm of matter, the most subtle. And then you have soul, which sort of is that spectrum of colors that's gradually moving the soul or the consciousness within the soul into ever more dense state, and then body becomes the receptive principle for those energies of the soul. So that's that triad of the self. So the intellect is that aspect of mind that is latent within that field of the not self that these three principles are engaging with and existing. So the intellect is really the corollary of the spirit. It's that Shakti of the spirit, and exists as a fourth state or condition that emerges alongside the threefold self. So this fourth condition was called by the Pythagoreans the Tetrad, and it symbolized to them law's rulership over material creation. At root, the divine intellect, or this principle of intellect, this Tetrad, the principle of 4, this intellect represents the mind's capacity to differentiate and partition undefined absolute consciousness into a bound and localized experience of self. This partitioning takes place by means of law, implying that the self is a lawful creation of the divine intellect. The intellect's primary function is to organize and guide the self's creative engagements with matter. This it does from within or behind the veil of matter itself. The intellect should therefore be understood as an administrating power of deity that rules over creation, governing it from, quote, beyond the veil. It is here at the level of the tetrad or intellect that the complete set of intellectual numbers are first unfolded, spanning from the monad to the decad. Throughout the duration of universal creation, the vast hierarchy of evolving life forms existing within the universe are born, they die, and then they're reborn again, always in relation to the fixed presence of this divine intellect. So the divine intellect is matter, but it's the intelligence in matter. And the self is always existing in relation to this intelligence. And the spirit of the self is one with this intelligence. And the 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 soul principle, Vishnu, engages with it also on an intimate level. You could say Maya is with Vishnu, and might say Mahamaya is with Brahma. But they engage intimately at those levels, and so you can almost look at Maya and Shiva as like a as like a yang and yin version of themselves. So they both are involved with the creation of material forms, but this principle of Shiva is creating based on an archetype that this principle of intellect first creates or first designs before or it designs it alongside, I guess you might say, it designs it alongside the emergence of the self. So the self emerges in relation to this divine intellect, and this intellect designs the pattern of the self, which the self then actualizes as it becomes creation. So the intellect administers creation. So the divine intellect or tetrad is an immanent and immanent guiding presence that, when listened to and followed, leads the self toward the completion and fulfillment of its own existence, towards self-actualization, in other words. So the self, as it evolves its body and soul over the course of its great cycle of creation, does so by following the plan and guidance of the divine intellect. At this level of pure intellect, the grand plan or archetype of creation is created and preserved for rediscovery by the self. This rediscovery takes place as the self overcomes its attachment to Maya or matter, thereby transcending the illusion of the not self. So as the self rediscovers the law, it is simultaneously rediscovering the not self, or it's moving beyond and rediscovering only the universality of consciousness, essentially. But it discovers this by following the plan of this intellectual principle. It is beyond the realm of the not self or matter where the deeper mysteries of the law are concealed. Seeking enlightenment, the self must eventually evolve its consciousness toward the realization of unity. The only way it can do this is by incrementally moving beyond the illusion of Maya, or matter, which is rooted in the designation of self from not self. Once this duality has been transcended, the self experiences nirvana, which is conscious re-identification with the law. From the perspective of self, the intellect resides within the domain of the not self or matter, which exists as a fourth state outside of the trinity of inner principles, spirit, soul, and body, that the self identifies with. In other words, Mahamaya, personifying the intellect, is experienced as the not self by the triad of Brahma, Vishnu, Shiva. This higher domain of intellect is the mother of the self, or as the Buddhists say, the mother of the Buddha. Here, the mother principle represents a sublime spiritual state of being whose existence is within creation, but which transcends self-existence. So the self exists in relation and is actually born from this higher principle. So it's the mother of the self. In sum, the intellect is the basis of the tetrad. It represents the principle of universal intelligence that is ever present within creation. As such, it is ever available for the self to listen to, follow, and eventually become one with. The self manifests across three domains of existence: spirit, soul, and body, which exist in relation to this fourth state, the intellect. Given that self is masculine in nature, it is actively manifesting its being. That's why it's a yang kind of principle, masculine. The intellect can be thought of as a feminine Shakti of this principle, receiving self's threefold creative energies and converting them into embodied life forms, which are designed after a quaternary pattern. So they take on the nature of both the three and the four. Intellect is a feminine or yin power inherent to matter. This power is that of law as an ever-present factor within matter. This law receives and guides the masculine creative energies of the self and converts them into a universe of growing and evolving embodied life forms. These life forms are born and extend across four dimensions or worlds of material existence, the level of pure intellect being the first and highest of these four worlds. And the next section is actually titled The Four Worlds, so we'll be going into that in a moment. All right, part L, the four worlds. The cosmic mother or divine intellect contains within it the entire plan and pattern for the self's life cycle of existence. So remember, this intellect principle or this high spiritual principle of mind exists or emerges as the corollary state to the self's emergence. So it's within this, or concealed within the mystery of the not self. This divine plan is initially conceived by intellect on the first and highest plane of matter, which is again Mahamaya, before becoming internalized by the self across all three domains of its being: spirit, soul, and body. And so spirit, soul, and body interface with Maya, and then beyond Maya is Mahamaya, which is the mother of the self. So as the self internalizes the mother's plan, so to speak, or this intellect, the plan of the intellect, it makes it objective by enlivening it with its own consciousness. So the plan exists in the mother, and then the self enlivens this plan with its own being. The intellect receives this injection of consciousness and forms it into a material expression. And this material expression is a universal form, designed according to the intellect's blueprint, initial blueprint. So the universal form exists within matter and is composed of three domains, or is partitioned into three domains of being, each residing on its own specialized plane of material existence. The spirit has its own plane, the soul has its plane, and then the body has its plane. These become the three material worlds of creation, which are embedded within a fourth, which is that of the pure intellect, or the pure source of matter, this idea of mind existing as this receptive principle of the self. So in total, there are four overlapping domains, planes, or worlds of manifest existence, with the three lower existing in relation to the first and highest. And that first and highest level is the divine intellect, or the cosmic mother. So she's the first, highest, and greatest of the set of four. And so likewise, the second principle, the spirit, it contains the other two within itself, the lesser two within itself. And then likewise, the soul, which is the third from above, it contains the fourth principle within itself. So there's this nesting Russian doll kind of situation. The highest plane of the four planes of existence, or material existence, I should say, is that of the absolute, which in this case corresponds to this trinity of Brahman, Mahamaya, and Brahma, which is the father, mother, and child principles of creation. And so it's here at this primary level of existence that the archetypal plan for self-existence is first conceived, or self-consciousness, I should say. So it's here at this primary level of existence that the archetypal plan for self-consciousness is first conceived. And it's conceived by this high spiritual principle of mind, which emerges directly out of this absolute unbound state of consciousness. So this exists on an absolute level, and then this emergence of mind takes place once again within the self. Once the self is formed, then it kind of reproduces the pattern of its own creation and activates an inner power of mind within itself. So this inner power of mind and this external power of mind is involved with this relation, this concept of matter and mind and intellect. So here I hope you're getting an appreciation of the fact that matter is not this like simple and cliche thing that you just conclude, there's matter as this field of negation and it exists counter-opposed to spirit and therefore it's bad. Because here we're understanding that mind is actually this dynamic factor and matter is actually mind, or it's what we perceive as matter is the product of mind, which is partitioning consciousness in a particular way in order to create a particular type of experience. So the highest plane is that of this pure intellect and the host of this pure intellect, which is the Brahman, which is the absolute self. So it is here at this primary level that the plan for the self is first conceived, and then the self actualizes this plan across the lower three worlds. So the second highest plane of these four worlds is that of the spirit, and that corresponds to Brahma. So here with Brahma, the plan for self-existence is first actualized, or begins to be actualized. It is on this plane that the apex of self-existence can be found. For consciousness to go beyond this plane and reach the absolute, the boundary of self-existence must be pierced. So this is the boundary of self-existence, this plane of spirit. The third of the four worlds is that of the soul, and it corresponds to Vishnu. This plane is polarized between two states of expression, one higher and one lower. The higher spiritual pole of the soul is predominantly yin, or receptive in nature, and is termed the anima, or spiritual soul, while its lower material aspect is predominantly yang, or active in nature, and is called the animus, or animal soul. The last of the four planes, or the four worlds, is the dense material earthly domain of the body. This plane is administered over by, on one hand, Shiva, the soul's lower animus aspect, its form building principle. But that form building principle has to move in relation to something else. So that thing that it moves in relation to is this tetrad, this principle of intellect. And it's ever present in matter. So it's ever guiding Shiva's creative impulses. So the intellect's ever present, context within which the self is moving. And so for this reason, the intellect, or Mahamaya, should be understood as forever guiding Shiva's impulses and guiding them into a creative direction, so that it produces forms that are purposeful in a certain way. And these forms that it's like guides Shiva into creating are ones which serve the long-term destiny of the self, which only the mother truly knows. So the self's own destiny is hidden to it by means of its own designation of this not self concept. So I hope this is making some manner of sense to you guys. All right, so next section, which is section M, and it's called Shiva the Demiurgus. Note that the threefold creative powers of the self, which are personified once more in Hinduism as Brahma, Vishnu, Shiva, required the pre-existence of a domain of not self or matter for their expression. The self's ability to express its own inner powers and potentials depends upon matter's existence as a counterposing state. It is within this domain of matter, which is also the realm of the not self, that the divine intellect is concealed. This principle of intellect, which the Pythagoreans called the Tetrad, represents law's rulership over material creation. This is a summary of what we went over. Shiva, the Hindu principle representing the world soul's form-building animus principle, was given the name the Demiurgus by the Greeks. In the ancient Sanskrit language, this same principle was termed manas, M-A-N-A-S. Being the builder of material form, Shiva, or manas, is the aspect of self most directly involved in material creation. As a masculine principle representing the soul's animus aspect, or masculine aspect, Shiva actively generates three qualities of energy: one creative, one preservative, and one destructive. These three qualities of energy, which are active or yang in essence, are projected into matter, which is yin in essence. Being receptive in nature, matter receives these energies and converts them into form. This it accomplishes through the quiet, guiding presence of the intellect, or Mahamaya, which guides and directs the masculine creative energies of Shiva, so that it inhabits and vivifies a soul pattern. These creative energies, so that they inhabit and vivify a soul pattern that the intellect has designed and numerically encoded within matter. So the energy of the self moves into matter. It moves into these channels that have been encoded by this intellectual principle, so that they naturally are flowing in a way that is intended to guide towards a destined end, towards a result that is pre-specified. And the mother is this agency that does this planning and this pre-specification. So in this way, the intellect or cosmic mother exists within, behind, and throughout matter as its higher spiritual parent. Residing in its own rarefied state above and beyond matter, which is what the word Mahamaya literally translates to, the mother exists as the supreme intelligence of the universe. So, yeah, the principle of intelligence is actually a feminine principle, and the principle of wisdom becomes an active principle, and then the union of wisdom and intelligence becomes the father-mother principles that results in the formation of the universal form. Given that Shiva, or the Demiurgus, is masculine in nature, so-called the animus, and Mahamaya is feminine and called the anima, then it follows that the animus is intended to follow the leadership of the anima and not vice versa. Meaning the anima principle is superior and the animus principle is inferior. So the inferior is supposed to follow the superior. So by implication, cosmically, we live in a matriarchy with the feminine principle reigning supreme over manifest creation, which is itself a masculine connotes a masculine quality because it's actively being generated. So the feminine principle is the guiding light of this generation. The self or Christ principle, representing the world soul, exists always in relation to this greater cosmic mother, the Virgin, the Virgin Mary being a derivative of Maya. So exists always in relation to this greater cosmic mother who guides and nourishes the soul as it grows and develops through time, the world soul, but by implication, each individual soul as well. So the matrix of time and space that the self exists within is symbolically the womb of the mother. It is also the womb of the mysteries, for it is by becoming entangled in this matrix of matter that the self is initiated into higher states of wisdom and enlightenment by the cosmic mother. So the matrix of matter is actually a schoolhouse by which we are schooled, or the self is schooled by the mother, by the intellect. And it's schooled in the ways, and according to a plan, that the self is, its own existence is inseparable from the existence of this plan. So in sum, the purpose of manas, or the lower mind, is to build and evolve the universal form into the perfect material expression of its own archetypal design, a design that was first conceived and fashioned by the divine mind in the beginning of time. As it follows the plan of the divine mind or intellect, Shiva, or manas, this principle of the self, extends the consciousness of self into the plane of the not self or matter. It does this in order that it may build an unfolding sequence of forms or bodies. All bodily forms that Shiva fashions sum together to form one world body. So this body exists as a receptacle to receive and express the indwelling energies of the world soul and world spirit. The cosmic intellect's final archetypal design for creation will be brought into complete realization within the world of matter at the final end of time and not before then. Until then, life is a process of moving toward the attainment of this final predestined end state. In the course of time, it is Shiva, this form-building principle. It is Shiva's mission to build an ever more perfect world body, one that will serve as a perfected vehicle for the expression of the intelligence of the world soul and the wisdom of the world spirit. So the body becomes the world body becomes a means to unite the full powers of both the spirit and the soul, or wisdom and intelligence. It is Shiva's purpose to evolve the world body through its power to build, preserve, and destroy forms toward a state of final, complete, and balanced expression, where every power and potential available to the self is expressed in its fullest and most complete form within its own sort of specialized bodily vehicle. And Shiva is the divine power responsible for bringing the grand project to completion. He is the great builder, with a divine intellect or cosmic mother serving as the great architect guiding his efforts. So I hope I was able to discern a little bit between these principles of 3 and 4. And as we'll be seeing here, 3 and 4 come together to give birth to 5. So 5 becomes the child of 4 and 3. And that is what's depicted in the famous Pythagorean theorem, which we'll be getting to. But my initial title for this article was actually the Pythagorean theorem. So anyway, that's the end of section M. It's called Shiva the Demiurgus, and now we're going to be moving it on to N, which is the cross of matter. And a cross is going to be associated with this principle of 2 and also with 4 to some degree, but we're talking about mind, the principle of mind, and the cross as a manifestation of mind moving into matter, or mind's presence within matter. So this is part N, the cross of matter. As Manly Hall explains, the quaternary, or principle of 4, represents the cross upon which the logos, or principle of 3, is crucified. So that's a quote from him. The quaternary, or 4, or the tetrad, you could say, represents the cross upon which the logos, or the principle of 3, is crucified. So 3 is formed, but doesn't become objective until it moves into 4. And when it moves into 4, it becomes symbolically crucified. And we'll be going more into what that means. Referencing back to the ancient symbol of the dot in the circle, with its 3 elements of the dot, the circumference, and the line forming an interval between them, we can imagine a 4th stage emerging in the form of a cross, which extends out from the central dot in 4 directions to divide the circle into 4 quarters. And these 4 quarters are what's meant by the quaternary. In geometric terms, the addition of this 4th factor, or point, in relation to the triad of principles constituting the self, forms on the level of a surface a square, and on the level of a solid a tetrahedron. Here we see that geometric form emerges as the 4th stage of the creation process. As discussed above, the emergence of this quaternary is associated with the principle of intellect. Creation begins with the dot, moves to the line, and becomes the surface. Then, with its 4th step, it extends to become a solid. These 4 stages or steps are what is necessary for the mind to generate the universe as a material creation. In this manner, material creation is patterned according to a quaternary design. This quaternary design is a reflection of the 4 stages required for the mind to extend its reach from the abstract, immaterial state of the intellect, which symbolically you could say is the point, down to the dense material realm of the body, which is the solid. So you have the point, the line, the surface, and then the solid. So the body is that 4th state of the solid, and the intellect is that 1st. And then in between, you have those 2 other tiers. But overall, when the intellect designs creation, it does so according to a plan of 4. According to the Kabbalists, creation takes place across 4 worlds, which become objectified in space as the 4 cardinal directions of north, south, west, and east. Esoterically, 4th is also associated with the mystery of the Tetragrammaton, the 4-letter name of God. For example, in ancient Hebrew, the name Jehovah, the Lord of material creation, is written with 4 letters. JHVH, no vowels, just only consonants. Furthermore, alchemy conceives material creation as arising from the chemistry of 4 primary elements: air, fire, water, and earth. These 4 elements are associated with the soul's emanation of body, which in manifestation extends across 4 auric fields: 1 physical, 1 vital, 1 emotional, and 1 mental. And just to build out a little bit further, Carl Jung in his model of the psyche pinpoints 4 essential powers or elements of psychic activity, and he describes those as two polarities which are form a cross. And so on the vertical axis you have intuition and sensation, and then on the horizontal axis you have thought and feeling. And so that those are associated, or you can extrapolate from those four mental powers or capacities, the four elements of alchemy. So all over the place we see this organizing principle of four when it comes to material existence. To the Pythagoreans, four symbolizes not only material creation, but more specifically the rulership of law over material creation. It is a function and purpose of the divine intellect to ensure the sovereign authority of the law within creation. Through the invisible guiding hand of the intellect, the universe manifests, or is manifested, as the amphitheater of the law. Here, all beings are born into law, exist by means of law, and are guided toward a final destiny specified by law. In the world of form, all souls must come to learn and obey law. They must abide by its rules or perish by result. For this reason, four is the symbol of law's rulership over creation. It represents the administration of justice and order over the world of material form. And I say over, but it's really within and through. As Manly Hall describes it, being or consciousness is, quote, an infinitely evolving power growing up in infinite space. It evolves by continually realizing or actualizing its own infinite potential. The self's potential for self-expression and growth is established by the intellect, which conceives the self's archetype or master design. This design, this ontological blueprint, becomes actualized by the self gradually over the course of time as it grows and matures into self-realization. In this way, the initial plan or archetype conceived by the intellect becomes the law of existence for the self, dictating how its evolution is destined to take place and unfold. It, quote, sets forth the boundaries of a geometry in which creation can occur. So the law does that. And the law also reveals to deity the maximum of its powers, giving the ancient one its life system and sequence. So the self and the not self, and this idea of the not self is actually associated with the mystery of the law and of the mother. These are things that are all captured, and I like these quotes a lot, so I'm going to read them one more time. So the initial archetype or plan conceived by the intellect becomes, quote, the law of existence for the self. It dictates how its evolution is destined to take place and unfold. The law sets forth the boundaries of a geometry in which creation can occur, and it reveals to deity the maximum of its powers, giving the ancient one its life system and sequence. That was a quote. In summary, law is the true architect of creation. Through law, the cosmic mother or Mahamaya, the framework for self's existence and destiny is established. So spirit moves into matter to create form by referencing a numerical, mathematical, and geometric design template or archetype that has been pre-established by law. Deity moves according to law, which regulates and coordinates all movement within the field of space. So God existing in space must obey law. Therefore, law is the supreme good. Law is the eternal factor. And deity is evolving. Deity is moving. Deity is coming into and out of existence. But the context that specifies this whole pattern of deity is actually beyond deity. It's this aspect of law. And that's the end of section N, and now we're going to be moving into O. And this is called the divine intellect. All right, section O. It's called the divine intellect, and I made this as kind of a recap and summary of everything that we've covered so far. This is the halfway point of the article. And even along the way, I've already done some summaries and recaps. So, my approach is actually to take a few relatively basic ideas and then go over them again and again and again, and from all these different angles to really pull apart and extract all the meaning that's available, even among a few basic principles. So, we're up to the number 4 now, and think of how many hours of podcast material so far there's been, just picking apart and analyzing the relationship between 0, 1, 2, and 3. And now this episode we're looking at 4, and we're introducing 5. And so these are only, a handful of ideas or principles, but the amount of detail and nuance you can go into in comparing and contrasting them, and looking at the relationship between them all, that you can really build out a huge amount of depth. So that's what I'm really trying to do here. And part of my method is to go back over the same material again and again, but each time using slightly different language or approaching it from a different angle. And hopefully in that way, as you listen to it, you can build a sort of structure in your mind around these ideas, because you'll have so many different associations that you can that you've built between them and other ideas. So it's like you're building a architecture in your mind in a certain way. You can look at it like that. You're building up a pattern, and I'm hoping that help by going over the ideas again and again, it'll help reinforce that pattern. So that's what the idea is behind this section. Again, it's called the divine intellect. So to recap, the self emerges as a threefold being who exists in relation to a counterposing domain of not self. This not self is actually Isis, the earth mother. It's also Nut, the sky goddess. And these are two relative states of one principle, which is the divine intellect, who preserves the law within creation. That's what this really means. Every aspect of creation has a law component that's associated with it. So we communicate with the law through the mother. The self's growth and evolution is ensured as long as it keeps to the mother's laws, i.e. to the universal intelligence's plan and design. Same thing. By following the mother's plan, the self is guided along the path that leads ultimately to the final realization of its destiny and spiritual purpose, the reabsorption of its consciousness back into the unbound, undefined, eternal condition of the absolute. So the mother goddess, in both her sky and earth polarities, or Nut and Isis, personify the divine order and intelligence as active creative agencies in the universe, ones that the self engages with at every stage of its life journey. So this is law as something that you can intimately participate in an experience of. The initial plan or design that this cosmic mother or divine intellect conceives at the beginning of time becomes the basis of self's existence. For this reason, the self is symbolically born from this intelligence and exists as an embodiment of its plan. The partitioning of unity into diversity occurs by means of a plan and pattern. The design of this pattern becomes encoded in matter through the power of intellect. The divine plan is initially conceived by the divine intellect, who is often called the cosmic mother. Once fashioned, this plan for the universe becomes imprinted in space as law. Self then imbues its life energy into space, or injects sexually, phallically, injects its life energy into space, where it gets taken hold of by the mother and partitioned into the creation of living forms existing in space. In this way, the divine intellect partitions the unified consciousness of self into the diverse experience of becoming many different individualized selves. While this partitioning takes place, the intellect remains always over top and throughout, guiding the whole process, maintaining order and organization at all levels, such that a unity of consciousness remains ever present, binding all parts together into one wholeness. Through law, parts are bound together to form a whole, the self. For us, this divine self is the galaxy, or in a more local case, it is our solar system. And even closer, our terrestrial Earth ecosystem, which functions as a whole, comprised as a sum of internal parts. Each level of wholeness that we're talking about here, the galaxy, the solar system, etc., is a deity or god on its own level of existence. And each wholeness, or god or deity, each wholeness is nested within a yet greater level of wholeness. It's like the solar system is within the galaxy. The galaxy is within the larger superstructure. So each self, or each level, is its own self, and then each self exists within a yet greater or more universal self. So there's unities within unities. This is the fundamental pattern of reality. And that's the end of that section, section O, that recap kind of section. Now we're going to be looking at P. And this is Isis, mother of the mysteries. And again, we're just going further and further into this principle of intellect and the divine feminine and in matter and how all these things are linked together. The initiates of ancient civilization viewed Earth as a great schoolhouse of the mysteries in which we grow, are tried, and are tested. That's actually a quote from Manly Hall. The ancients revered the maternal principle of deity, the principle of divine intellect or universal intelligence, as the matriarch of these mysteries and of man's initiation here on Earth. This maternal principle embodies the divine plan. Once conceived at the level of pure intellect, the divine plan becomes imprinted within matter in the form of Maya or Isis, who personifies the ever-present power of universal intelligence here on Earth. Within her mysteries, the mother gives birth to adepts, who become ambassadors of her intelligence here on Earth. These adepts are perfected philosophers who have become, quote, lovers of Sophia, with Sophia symbolizing law or archetype. In the West, the psychological shift from a maternalistic to a paternalistic orientation coincides with the elimination of initiation as a dominant aspect of man's cultural life. So now we're trying to explain where this maternal archetype is not a factor in modern civilization. So where did it disappear to? And this idea of a universal intelligence. And so what we're looking at is a sort of archetypal disappearance of this principle as mankind goes into a materialistic orientation in its consciousness. So the Jehovah element or the Demiurgus element becomes emphasized over the divine feminine element or the Mary or Maya element. And so this shift from maternalistic to a paternalistic orientation coincides with not only with a motion towards materiality, but also the elimination or the corresponding elimination of initiation as a part of the social institutions of the collective. So when the doors to the mysteries closed, and this happened in the transition age, the kind of period of transition between Aries and Pisces. When the doors to the mysteries closed, the terrestrial institution dedicated to the service of the divine feminine, the earth goddess or cosmic mother, disappeared from public awareness. Consequently, civilization has been dominated by a paternalistic concept of religion and social order ever since. Through the institution of science, man rediscovers the Earth Mother, who reveals through her mysteries the framework of cosmic law that man must inevitably learn and obey. Elliot. It is the function of science to study and rediscover the laws behind material existence. These laws are ever present. They are found in every domain of nature that scientists have looked. At every moment, physical creation embodies law in its space and time elements. By scientific investigation into the structures, forms, and dynamics behind material creation, the workings of law are revealed to the intellect of man. This material in the philosophy of science we're going to be going over again in a future article on Francis Bacon. But the foundations of all this begins with Pythagoras and the philosophy of number. And in particular, we're understanding here that the existence of law throughout nature is evidence of this intellect, this universal intelligence that is ever present within matter. So what we've been talking about, this idea of Isis, is revealed through nature in the form of natural law. And so through science, we are actually worshiping, we don't realize it, but we are in a way revering and sort of worshiping the body of this cosmic mother, the body of the law. The Pythagoreans were philosopher-scientists. They viewed material creation as symbolic of deity's inner administrative power and sought to study it in order that they may discover the inner sacred laws governing the universe's long-term evolution and destiny. From the perspective of the Pythagoreans, in a universe that is ensouled with spirit, to be a scientist is to study the anatomy of God. The Pythagoreans, as scientists, studied the workings of the world in order to learn and obey the most sacred laws of deity. In so doing, the Pythagoreans sought to discipline their body and minds so as to become perfect representations and embodiments of these laws. In this way, to the Pythagoreans, science was an aspect of a larger philosophy of life, one where science and philosophy are connected with religion to form a sacred trinity of human institutions. And if you follow this channel, you've heard of me, I'm sure, talk about the relationship between science, religion, and philosophy, and that's what I'm referring to here. So the mother, who was the primary deity worshipped in primitive religions, contains within her nature the vision and plan for the final archetypal design of the universe. This archetype specifies the final end state that the self must strive toward and evolve to become. Only at the end of its life cycle, at the fullness of time, does the self attain this final design state. Until then, self is in a constant process of becoming. The stages of this process are indicated by the motion of time. Knowing the end in advance, the mother acts as a guiding presence, gradually leading the self along a path of self-experience that will stimulate it to grow in a certain direction, according to a predefined pattern. By obeying Mother's law, the self is led peacefully along the path that will inevitably lead to the fulfillment of its destiny. But when the self breaks this law and moves outside of this path, the law dictates that retribution in the form of karma must follow. In sum, the law or archetype after which material creation is patterned is initially conceived and preserved at the level of the divine intellect. This intellect is a yin or feminine power of deity and is traditionally associated with the archetype of the mother goddess. The function or purpose of the divine intellect or cosmic mother is to specify the complete design of self's inner and outer or psychological and physical dimensions of being. This design becomes embodied within matter in the form of law. The self must follow the dictates of law just as the child must obey the guidance of its mother. In other words, law is inherent to space, and self, existing in space, must therefore obey the mother's laws. All right, that's the end of that section. Isis, Mother of the Mysteries. And now we're going to be looking at section Q, which is the Pythagorean theorem. And I have a diagram of the geometry of the Pythagorean theorem, which is the famous 3, 4, 5 triangle, the right triangle of Pythagoras. So the square of the side of 3, which is 9, plus the square of the side of 4, which is 16, equals the square of the hypotenuse, which is 5, and that square is 25. So you have the sum of the first two equals the hypotenuse, and that's the famous Pythagorean theorem. And what that theorem illustrates philosophically is the relationship between the intellectual principles of 3, 4, and 5. So those intellectual principles become Osiris, Isis, and Horus in the mythology of the Egyptians. Or it becomes self, the consciousness of the self, the intelligence of the mother, combined to form the world body, the world form, which emerges in the form of a universal man, or a grand man, or an archetypal man. And this wholeness, this grand man, is the macrocosm, and then the human species is the microcosm, and that's how it goes basically. So we're going to be looking at this section and jumping into it right here. All right, the Pythagorean theorem. In popular culture, most people are familiar with the name Pythagoras through his famous Pythagorean theorem, which every student is taught in school as part of their basic mathematical curriculum. The Pythagorean theorem simply states that the sum of the square of the numbers 3 and 4 sum to 25, which is equivalent to the square of the number 5, thus 3 squared plus 4 squared equals 5 squared. Geometrically, this relationship is diagrammed through Pythagoras' famous 3-4-5 triangle, which is illustrated above. In Pythagorean philosophy, this triad, 3, 4, and 5, is evoked to illustrate the relationship between heaven, earth, and man. These three principles are depicted in Egyptian philosophy under the triad Osiris, Isis, and Horus, with Osiris corresponding to the number 3, Isis to the number 4, and Horus to the number 5. As seen in the Pythagoreans' famous theorem, 3, 4, and 5 represent the primordial trinity of father, mother, and child. Here we find an active spiritual principle, Osiris, fertilizing a receptive maternal principle, Isis, in order that a world form may be born in the image of an archetypal man, who is Horus. So let's go deeper a bit into the relationship dynamic between these three members of the divine family. Within the world soul is generated the world form. This form, as a cumulative entity, exists in the image of a grand man. This grand man is held as an internally generated seed image of the self. Within it is embedded the human kingdom, which exists as a miniature reflection of the design of the whole. The human kingdom is the microcosm of the world form and world soul, in other words. It exists within each as a concentrated downward reflection of it. So we are the instruments of the self within its manifest creation, within the world of matter. So of all the kingdoms, we play the role of something like the nervous system of the self, the manifested self, this divine being that is the world. The archetypal man, the world soul, was termed by ancient Hindus the Manu. The Buddhists modified this term into the name Manushi Buddha, meaning human Buddha. The Egyptians, meanwhile, called him Horus, the son of Isis and Osiris. Horus, who the Pythagoreans called the Pentad, is the seed archetype of man. He is also the seed archetype for the world soul itself, as the two, man and the world, share a common archetype in tandem. Horus is the personification for man's final evolutionary form. This evolutionary form is achieved when the individual becomes, in miniature, like the world form itself, which is the macrocosm. Since man is made in the image of Horus, then the outstanding individual who rises to become one with the archetype of themselves becomes like Horus. Therefore, Horus represents the adept self, the archetype of the fully enlightened man. As we can now see, the human soul shares a special relationship with the world soul. Each is patterned according to a common design template, which is the archetype or the law. Each is therefore subject to the same framework of law. Man is conceived and designed as a microcosm of deity itself, meaning we are patterned after deity's own archetypal seed image. The archetypal design of man is conceived initially at the level of the intellect, which is the number 4, the Tetrad, before being brought into generation at the level of 5, which is the Pythagorean number of man, the design of man. The human soul, symbolized in esoteric philosophy by the number 5, unfolds the power of deity in both its heaven and earth dimensions. From Osiris, man inherits the capacity for self-knowing, the intuitive apperception of truth. From Isis, man gains the power of intelligence gained through experience. And as 5, or Horus, man unites these powers together and brings the powers and potentials of each into actualization and realization within the domain of matter, or within the context of matter. Horus, the child of Isis and Osiris. Earlier, we defined the Pythagorean principle of 3, the Triad, as the spirit of the world, and the Tetrad, or 4, as the principle of intellect existing behind and within matter. The form that this intellect designs within the self becomes 5, the Pentad, which represents the archetypal man born as the child of heaven and earth. Here we find the story of the world soul moving to focus its powers internally so that an inner image of the self may be generated as a material form. This internal process of image making occurs as a great cosmic meditation taking place within the self. The internal image that the self meditates into existence is the form of a divine man, or is in the form of a divine man, the Manu, or what in Buddhism is termed the Manushi Buddha, or human Buddha. This man is the archetypal man, the man who is the world. This is man, son of mind, or more accurately, man, son of wisdom and intellect, the father-mother polarities of mind. In the mythology of the Egyptians, this man is Horus, Osiris being his father and Isis his mother. Here, Osiris and Isis represent the self and intellect, which together unite to create man as 5, the world form, made in the image of the Creator. As Manly Hall writes, man is the form which may be perceived visibly, the archetypal form. Therefore, man may be regarded as between heaven and earth. In the language of the Egyptians, Horus, personifying this archetypal man, is made in the microcosmic image of Osiris, the world's self. And Isis is the power that does this fashioning of Horus. The Pythagoreans designated 5 the number of man, not just man as an individual human, but also mankind as a holistic entity, a single supersystem containing all individual humans within itself, like parts within a whole. Man, the Pentad, is the microcosm of the self, which is the Triad. The divine mind, existing in the form of intellect, is the intermediary between the two, separating them on one level and uniting them on another. And this divine mind is the Tetrad. Man exists as an individual self in order that the universal self may have an instrument within his creation through which he may experience his own creation. In order to undergo this experience of self, this archetypal man must go through the experience of falling into ignorance before gradually regaining enlightenment through a series of internal realizations which take place only through the attainment of self-knowledge gained from life experience. In other words, man's dharma, his archetypal storyline, is for his collective consciousness to begin in a spiritual state, before then falling out of orientation with the spiritual state, becoming materialistic and ignorant in the process. Then, gradually after much suffering, man gradually reawakens to a remembrance of his spiritual origins by going through a sequence of initiations in the temple of Isis, the Earth Mother. At the culmination of these initiations, the spirit in man reawakens to an identification with the spirit of the universal self, and enlightenment results. So in this Earth Temple of Initiation, overseen by Isis, the self is initiated, and the self is initiated through us, through our initiations. In short, mankind is created as a microcosm of the Creator. Our destiny is to have our consciousness cast into the depths of matter, which is really the realm of the not-self, thereby falling into ignorance or Maya. Here, in the state of ignorance, trapped in illusion, the spiritual seed consciousness in man identifies with the individual principle of ego rather than with the universal principle of self, which is its truest state. In this way, through man, the unified consciousness of self is extended into billions of experiences of individualized ego consciousnesses. And this is what humanity is. Here, under the gravitational pull of billions of human egos, the consciousness of universal self becomes ensnared. Man's task is to evolve itself out of this self-imposed quagmire of illusion. In so doing, man releases the consciousness trapped under his ego back so that it may re-identify with its true owner, the universal self. When this re-identification happens, the consciousness of self extends down and takes control of its vehicle, which has now been prepared to become a useful instrument and servant of its greater plan. For a long time now, the consciousness in man has become ensnared in the illusions of matter. But inevitably, it is our destiny to eventually rediscover our true spiritual estate. This we accomplish through the long and painful process of undergoing life experience and overcoming ignorance by gaining self-knowledge. And that is the end of section R, Horus, the child of Isis and Osiris. And now finally, part S, man, grand symbol of the mysteries. This is the last section of part 3. To review everything we've covered now in part 3, we can now begin by saying that the father and mother principles of creation, the Triad and Tetrad of the Pythagoreans, represent the two poles of the macrocosm, its yang and yin polarities. As a consequence of these two principles first separating and then reuniting, a generative act takes place in which the divine self produces, through its own inner power of intellect, an inner self-image, which emerges in the form of an archetypal man. As the Mahayana school terms him, this man is the Manushi Buddha, the human Buddha. He is born as an internally generated seed image of the self, planted as an archetypal seed within the dark soil of his lower earthly nature, where it propagates like a cell and generates out of his own inner potential the manifest being of man. Manly Hall explains this germination process in terms of Adam Kadma, the personification of this archetypal man by the Kabbalistic school of Jewish philosophy. Quote, "There was only one man. He was called Adam Kadma by the Kabbalists. He is the first acorn and began as a simple unity. Now there are millions of men, but the sum of them is always Adam Kadma. He is the germ, and all fires are lighted from his altar." Man, the Pentad, is released through the experience of growing and learning. Through the experience of living, man exhausts diversity of experience. When man has experienced everything, he really has experienced one thing, the manifest life of the divine self. The Tetrad, or cosmic mother, with her divine intellect, fashions up the matrix of illusion necessary for self to inhabit, in order that this learning and growth within the self be allowed to take place. From Osiris, the father of the Pentad, man inherits the wisdom of spirit. This wisdom incorporates an enlightened understanding of the existence of unity within and behind diversity. This unity within diversity is revealed through equilibrium. When one finds equilibrium, one finds the presence of spirit. From Isis, the mother, man inherits intelligence. This represents his ability, or man's ability, to tune his own lesser intellect to the greater intellect of the Creator so that he may think in harmony with the mind of God. The wise man is one who is humble to the laws of God. Therefore, the philosopher reveres the cosmic mother. He is a son of the widow. These two powers of the world soul, wisdom and intelligence, are synthesized within man into a third soul power, that of force. Force is the ability to move and guide material energies and elements. Man's divine power, force, enables his ability to become the alchemist, the transmuter of the base metals or elements that are present in matter, the quaternary, and to take these four and to convert them into a pure, enlightened spiritual essence or gold, the quintessence or the ether. Manly Hall elaborates, the child principle as force becomes the avenger, who brings into creation all that is to be achieved by father and mother. By implication, man's growth unites heaven and earth, fulfilling the potential of each. So that's the end of this section and also the end of this episode. So thank you very much for tuning in. I hope you'll read the article and also the larger series. And check back. There's one more section. It's going to be revisiting some of these themes that we've been discussing so far in the first three sections, particularly the 3 and the 4 and the 5. But we're going to be looking at them or framing them now through the lens of the kind of a case study. And we're going to be using the golden section or the golden ratio as a means to, as sort of a proof of concept, I guess, of this organization scheme that we've been talking about of the Triad and the Tetrad and the Pentad. So these ideas are going to be involved with this principle of the golden section. And we're also going to be touching on the philosophy of science and what the existence of the golden section throughout nature says about the philosophy of science. So we're going to be looking at those. There's a lot of information to go into when it comes to this subject of the golden the golden ratio, and I'm only just going to go into a little bit of it in this next video. And my idea is to go further into some of the very interesting elements of this golden section concept that I've discovered over the years in a subsequent book. So it won't be in this book, but I have a whole book on the philosophy of design that I would like to write as a follow-up to this, and this project, which is really on philosophy, its origin, purpose, and destiny more specifically. And so as a follow-up, I want to do one on the philosophy of design, and that'll have more information about the golden section. But the foundational ideas are going to be discussed in the conclusion of this chapter on Pythagoras, and I hope you'll tune back in for that. And until then, thank you very much, and God bless.